Well, good morning. Thank you very much for joining me on this video. I want to talk to you a little bit about the issues that come up when we have a tenanted property. And we've all, from time to time, had a property that's occupied by a tenant, and this landlord, who's the owner, wants to sell. And it creates some unique problems. You're probably aware that these relationships between a landlord and tenant are governed by the Residential Tenancies Act. And it's very one-sided consumer protection legislation. But we can work around that. But there's a couple of glaring problems that we have to be aware of anytime we get in this situation. And the first is that the tenants are actually not required to move. We had a situation, we've had a lot of them, but one comes to mind in particular, where we sold a property, it wasn't our listing, but it was occupied by a tenant. The buyers were coming in from out of town, and the transaction was supposed to close the 1st of July, I remember. And so it called for the landlord to give the N12 notice to the tenant, the prerequisite notice requiring them to move within 60 days. So they were supposed to move the end of June. Well, it became apparent that they had no intention of moving. I got permission from the listing agent to speak to the tenants. I spoke to the tenants, and they said, no, we're going to be out of town on a holiday at that time. We've actually decided to buy, and we're not closing till the middle of July, so that's when we're moving out. Well, I said, doesn't it bother you that you're in defiance of the act and of the law? They've given you a 60-day notice. I said, they could come along, and I was bluffing here. I said, they could maybe come along and throw your furniture all out on the lawn. They said, oh, no, they can't do that. They said, we contacted the landlord and tenant board, and they said, oh, don't worry about it. Take your time moving out. It'll take them months to evict you. That's a problem. Our governing body is saying, well, it's 60-day notice, but just disregard it. I'd offered to put their furniture in storage for them, and they said, no, we're not interested in a second move. They didn't move out till the middle of July, and the people moving in had to work around it. So the fact of the matter is that the N12 notice, and all the notices, the N12 notice states right on it, you do not have to move out if you disagree with what the landlord has put in the notice. So they're saying a 60-day notice, but you don't have to move out if you don't want to move out. Well, it creates some real serious problems for the buyer, the seller, and the agent. One situation I want you to realize is, let's suppose on the offer, maybe you're representing the buyer, on the offer you've set it up that the seller is promising vacant possession. You know, on the agreement of purchase and sale, it automatically calls for vacant possession. It states, upon completion, vacant possession of the property shall be given to the buyer unless otherwise provided for in this agreement. So you state in the agreement of purchase and sale that the landlord will provide the N12 prerequisite notice requiring 60-day notice for the tenant to vacate. And that's all that is in the agreement of purchase and sale. The trouble is we're making a commitment about what a third party is going to do, and you can never guarantee what a third party is going to do. If that's what you put in the offer, if the tenant doesn't move out on closing, the landlord's in breach, because on the agreement of purchase and sale it says vacant possession unless there's some other provision. We haven't made any other provision, so the landlord's in breach. And it puts a pressure on the buyer. The buyer is in a position where he's having to make a decision. He's the one that's being poorly treated because he's not getting what he bargained for, but he still can't move in. So it's a problem. Now, you can create, and I would advise you to do this, especially if you're representing the seller or the landlord, and you put in there that, the seller agrees to provide the prerequisite 60-day notice requiring the tenant to vacate. However, he doesn't in fact warrant that the tenant will vacate. And in the event, upon closing, the tenant has not vacated the property, the buyer agrees to close the transaction and assume the eviction process. That is the way to handle it in anticipation of the tenant not moving out. But that may not be the greatest thing for the buyer. He may not be in a position where he can assume a tenant. You know, the landlord and tenant board is backlogged with 30,000 applications from landlords trying to evict tenants. It's a long process, and there's not enough processors, and so it takes 8 months or longer. In fact, if you listen to the recording, they'll say, if you haven't heard from us in 8 months, give us a call again. Well, And that's the other problem with the Landlord and Tenant Act and this whole eviction process, even if it is a eviction, non-fault eviction. It's a long, long process. One of the things that people have done to circumvent this is a process that's called cash for keys. And what they do is the landlord agrees to pay the tenant to move out. Across the street from my son, he got to know the people who were the occupants, who were the tenants, and the tenants told him this story. The landlord decided that he was going to sell the property. And so he went to the tenant and began to negotiate, and he ended up negotiating this. He said, I'll give you $10,000 cash to move out. I'll give you another $2,000 to cover your moving expenses, and assuming you're going to pay about $1,500 rent where you're moving to, I'll give you another $3,000 for first and last month's rent. So the landlord said to the tenant, I'll give you $15,000 to move out. The landlord's rationale was, when the tenant moves, if the tenant's there and I've got a property up for sale, it's going to be difficult to work around their schedule. They're not doing the greatest job looking after the property, and I'm always running the risk that they may not move out on closing. If I can get rid of them, I can spruce up the property. Maybe I will stage it, and I can show it whenever I want, and I'll make the $15,000 up in the sale price. So he felt it was a good deal to buy out the tenants, and tenants thought, found money. They were pretty excited about it. That's cash for keys. And of course, it can also work for delinquent tenants. You know, if a tenant gets in arrears, and I'd like to say that I don't really strongly endorse this because I don't like rewarding people for bad behavior, but here's the rationale. Let's suppose a tenant is paying, say, $1,800 a month, and he gets slower and slower in his rent, and the landlord works with him. Well, after 2 or 3 months of arrears, the landlord decides he needs to take action, and so he files an N4 to evict the tenant. Well, the reality is it's going to take him probably 8 months to get the tenant out, and if the tenant appeals it, it could take longer than that. By the time the tenant gets out, the landlord may have lost $20,000. So he may find it prudent to go to this tenant and say, look, here's what I'm willing to do. I will erase what you owe me now. I won't come after you for the shortfall, and in addition to that, I'll give you $5,000 to $10,000 cash to move out. Depending on the financial situation of the tenant, that may be a great option. He takes the money, he moves out. Now, it may not. The tenant may figure, well, I can ride this thing for a year, and I'm not going to accept that kind. And that's the one problem with it. The problem is that it's become a cottage industry. I've received some texts back and forth between landlords and tenants where they're discussing various things that crop up. And one I came across, I want to share with you real briefly. The tenant said, I received this letter from my landlord. What should I do? And he posted the letter. And it was a lovely letter. The landlord was saying, it breaks my heart to do this. I've sold the property. It was a duplex. He said, I've sold the property, and I'm going to require both tenants to move out because the new owner requires it for their own occupancy, and they're the caregiver of a special needs member of their family who requires the other unit. So I'm going to have to give you both notice, and I apologize for doing it, but I want to give you as much notice as possible, so at the end of this month you'll be getting the official notice. And the tenant said in this forum, he said, well, what should I do? Another tenant threw in his advice and said, tell him you're not going to move, but you can be bought, and start the negotiation at $50,000. So it's become a real serious cottage industry, and I don't like to see that. But you may want to keep it in mind. You may want to discuss it with your seller. If your seller is the landlord and it's a rented property, the concept of cash for keys, it may be the lesser of two evils. But if you're going to go that route, make sure that you get in writing the agreement between the two parties, and make sure that the tenant has moved out and has surrendered the keys before the landlord pays him the money, and then have the locks changed. Hope that makes sense. I want to thank you for investing your time. Talk to you again next week.